The dawn broke over Charleston harbor like a wound splitting open across the sky. Red and gold bled into the grey waters, painting the masts of merchant ships in shades of copper and ash. The air tasted of salt, sweat, and something darker. The smell of bodies packed too tightly below deck, of chains rusted by ocean spray, of dreams suffocated before they could take their first breath. Cato stood at the edge of the dock, his bare feet gripping the weathered planks, as if rooting himself to something solid in a world that offered him nothing but instability. He was 32 years old, though his face carried the weight of 50 seasons. His skin was the color of polished mahogany, marked with keloid scars that formed a map of suffering across his shoulders and back. Each raised line a testament to punishment, each ridge a memory he carried in silence. The morning shift had begun an hour before sunrise, as it always did. Around him, 24 enslaved men moved like shadows, loading and unloading cargo from the vessels that arrived daily. Tell me in the comments which country Jamaica you are from, and the Carolinas outer islands. This story. Barrels of molasses story and rum, made an impression of indigo and rice. Subscribe to the channel wrapped in burlap, so you don't miss any future stories. And sometimes, though never spoken aloud, human cargo, men, women, and children shackled in the holds, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that their lives had become currency. Cato worked in silence. He always did. While others muttered prayers or sang low spirituals to ease the burden, he remained quiet, his movements efficient and precise. He had learned long ago that silence was a form of survival. Words drew attention. Attention drew punishment. And punishment in Charleston could mean the whip, the branding iron, or worse, being sold away from the only people who remembered your name. "Move faster, boy!" The overseer's voice cut through the morning like a blade. Samuel Pritchard was a red-faced man with a belly that strained against his waistcoat and breath that reeked of last night's whiskey. He carried a leather strap coiled at his belt, and his fingers twitched toward it constantly, as if the act of striking flesh was the only way he knew to communicate. Cato lifted another barrel, his muscles straining against the weight. 120 pounds of molasses, the wood staves rough against his palms. He had lifted thousands of these barrels over the years. His body had memorized the motion. The bend of the knees, the engagement of the core, the careful balance required to avoid injury. An injured slave was a useless slave. A useless slave was a dead slave. "Yes, sir," Cato said, his voice flat and empty of emotion. He had perfected this tone, respectful enough to avoid punishment, devoid enough to retain some fragment of dignity. The harbor was already crowded despite the early hour. Charleston's economy breathed through these docks, even 4 years after the war had ended. The city still bore scars from the conflict. Burned buildings slowly being rebuilt, former Confederate soldiers now working alongside freed people in an uneasy coexistence. But slavery persisted in pockets, in places where old ways died hard, where men like Thomas Gadsden had found legal loopholes to maintain their labor force through debt peonage and convict leasing. The war had changed everything and nothing. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had freed slaves in rebel territories, but South Carolina had found ways to resist, to delay, to maintain control. Reconstruction brought federal troops and new laws, but it also brought resentment, violence, and the stubborn determination of men who refused to acknowledge that their world had ended. Merchants in fine coats negotiated prices near the customs house. Ship captains barked orders to their crews. Former plantation owners, now struggling to adapt to a labor market where they had to pay wages, arrived in carriages to inspect incoming shipments, their faces tight with barely concealed anger at how their world had shifted. And everywhere, always, were the formerly enslaved, some technically free but bound by contracts that differed from slavery only in name, others still held through legal fictions and intimidation. They moved through the streets like ghosts, acknowledged only when their labor was required. Cato set down the barrel and straightened, allowing himself a brief moment to look out across the water. The sea had always called to him in ways he couldn't explain. Perhaps because it represented the one thing his life lacked: vastness, possibility. The water didn't care about the color of a man's skin or the scars on his back. It simply was, indifferent and eternal. Cato. He turned to find his friend Marcus approaching, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. Marcus was younger, maybe 25, with a quick smile that he wore like armor against the world's cruelty. Where Cato kept his thoughts locked away, Marcus spoke them freely, though quietly enough to avoid the overseer's attention. "You hear about the Freedmen's Bureau meeting tonight?" Marcus asked, his voice low as he pretended to inspect the rope. "They say there's talk of new legislation. Real enforcement of the 14th Amendment." Cato's jaw tightened. The 14th Amendment had granted citizenship to former slaves, but in Charleston, citizenship meant little when men like Gadsden controlled the courts, the police, and the economy. Paper rights without power were just another form of mockery. "I'll believe it when I see it," Cato said quietly. "Laws don't mean much when the men enforcing them profit from breaking them." "I know," Marcus replied, his smile fading. "But sometimes I wonder if we all just refused, all of us at the same time. What could they do?" "They could kill us," Cato said simply. "And they would. Don't mistake their defeat in the war for acceptance. These people lost everything, and they blame us for it. They're more dangerous now than they ever were." Marcus was silent for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I get tired sometimes of being almost free, of having rights that exist only on paper." "We're not almost free," Cato said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We're still enslaved, just by different chains. Debt instead of ownership. Contracts instead of bills of sale. But the cage is still a cage." Before Marcus could respond, a commotion erupted near the far end of the dock. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of a horse whinnying in distress. Cato turned, squinting against the morning sun, trying to make sense of the sudden chaos. A rider was approaching along the harbor road, a young woman on a chestnut mare, her green riding habit billowing behind her like ocean waves. Even from a distance, Cato recognized her. Everyone in Charleston knew Governor Robert Scott's daughter, Catherine. She was 17, beautiful in the way that privilege makes beautiful. Well-fed, well-dressed, well-protected from the harsh realities that defined life for most people in this reconstructed colony. The horse was moving too fast, its hooves clattering dangerously on the wet planks of the dock. Catherine's face was flushed with exhilaration, her laughter carrying across the water. She rode like someone who had never known consequence, who believed the world would always bend to accommodate her desires. "She's going to hurt herself," Marcus muttered. Riding like that near the edge, the horse screamed. A barrel had rolled loose from one of the ships, clattering directly into the mare's path. The animal reared, its front legs pawing at empty air. Catherine's hands slipped from the reins. For one impossible moment, she seemed suspended, a girl caught between earth and sky, between safety and catastrophe. Then she fell. The splash was enormous, swallowing her green dress and auburn hair in one violent motion. The dock erupted in screams. Union soldiers stationed near the customs house began running, but they were too far away, their boots pounding uselessly against the wooden planks. The crowd that had been so busy with commerce moments before now stood frozen, watching the water where the governor's daughter had disappeared. Cato didn't think. Thinking would have stopped him. Thinking would have reminded him that even freed slaves who touched the governor's daughter could be lynched by angry mobs. Thinking would have calculated the risks, weighed his own survival against hers. But Cato didn't think. He ran. His feet carried him to the edge of the dock. Below, the harbor water churned grey-green and opaque. Catherine surfaced for just a moment, her mouth open in a soundless scream, her arms flailing uselessly. The heavy riding habit was dragging her down, the waterlogged fabric becoming an anchor around her small frame. Someone shouted, "She's drowning!" Someone else yelled, "Where are the soldiers?" But no one moved. In that terrible moment, Cato understood something profound about power and fear. These people, these former Confederate merchants and Union soldiers and fine ladies, were paralyzed by the same system that had enslaved him. They were afraid to act without orders, without permission, without someone of higher status telling them it was acceptable to save a life. Cato dove. The water was shockingly cold, stealing the breath from his lungs. The harbor was murky with silt and refuse, reducing visibility to almost nothing. He kicked downward, his arms sweeping wide, searching for any sign of the girl. His chest began to burn, his ears filled with the muffled roar of the sea. There, a flash of green fabric, sinking slowly toward the bottom. Cato swam deeper, his lungs screaming for air. His fingers closed around Catherine's arm, and he pulled her toward him. She was limp, unconscious, her face pale beneath the water. He kicked upward with everything he had, dragging them both toward the light that filtered down through the waves. They broke the surface together. Cato gasped, filling his lungs with the sweet Charleston air. Catherine's head lolled against his shoulder, water streaming from her nose and mouth. She wasn't breathing. "Help!" Cato shouted toward the dock. "Somebody help me!" Hands reached down. Marcus and two other dock workers had materialized at the edge. They hauled Catherine up first, laying her on the planks. Her lips were blue. Her chest didn't rise. Cato pulled himself up, water streaming from his clothes. The overseer Pritchard was there now, his face purple with rage or confusion, or both. "What have you done?" Pritchard demanded. "You touched her. You put your hands on—" "She's not breathing," Cato said, pushing past him and kneeling beside Catherine. He had seen this before. A child pulled from a well 5 years ago on the plantation. An old woman who collapsed in a rice field. He knew what to do. He tilted Catherine's head back, placed his mouth over hers, and breathed. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. Pritchard grabbed Cato's shoulder, but Marcus stepped between them. "He's saving her life!" Marcus shouted. "For God's sake, let him work." Cato breathed again and again. He pressed on Catherine's chest, counting the compressions the way he'd learned years ago. Breathe, press, breathe, press. His entire world narrowed to this rhythm, this desperate attempt to call a soul back from whatever darkness had claimed it. Catherine's body convulsed. Water erupted from her mouth. She coughed, gasped, and her eyes fluttered open. Confused, frightened, alive. The crowd erupted in cheers. Women wept. Men clapped Cato on the back, but he barely heard any of it. He sat back on his heels, trembling with exhaustion and the sudden weight of what he'd just done. He had saved the governor's daughter, and in Charleston, South Carolina, in the year 1869, in the midst of Reconstruction's chaos and the South's violent resistance to change, there was no way to know if that would mean his salvation or his death. The governor's mansion stood on Meeting Street like a monument to federal authority in a city that resented everything it represented. 3 stories of white-painted brick with tall windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in blinding squares of gold. Union soldiers guarded the entrance now, replacing the decorative iron gates that had been melted down for Confederate munitions. Magnolia trees still lined the walkway, their heavy white blooms filling the air with a scent both beautiful and cloying, sweetness concealing something darker underneath. Cato had never been inside these gates. Few formerly enslaved people had, except those who worked for the Republican governor's household. As he stood in the entrance hall that evening, still wearing his damp dock clothes, he felt the weight of every eye upon him. The marble floor beneath his feet was cold and impossibly clean. Gas lamps lined the walls, their flames steady and bright. Portraits of Union generals had replaced the stern-faced Confederates, but the painted eyes still seemed to follow his every movement with judgment. 2 soldiers flanked him, young men in blue uniforms, their hands resting on their rifle straps. They had been polite during the carriage ride from the docks, which unsettled Cato more than hostility would have. He wondered if they saw him as a hero or simply as another freed slave who didn't understand his place in this new, uncertain order. "The governor will see you now." The voice belonged to a thin man in a black coat, some kind of secretary. He looked at Cato with a mixture of curiosity and calculation, trying to determine how this situation might be politically useful. The soldiers guided Cato down a long hallway, hung with patriotic bunting and photographs of President Grant. His wet footprints marked the polished floor, each step leaving evidence of his presence in this place where he still didn't quite belong. They stopped before a set of double doors, carved with elaborate scenes, the eagles and stars of the Union, replacing whatever Confederate symbols had hung there before. The doors opened. Governor Robert Kingston Scott sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, papers spread before him like a map of his troubled administration. He was 42 years old, a former Union general who had been appointed governor by the military during Reconstruction. His face was weathered from years of war, and his eyes carried the weariness of a man trying to rebuild a society that actively resisted being rebuilt. He wore a simple dark suit, and his hands, scarred from battle, calloused from holding reins and rifles, rested on the desk's polished surface. Behind him stood Catherine, her auburn hair now dry and carefully arranged. She wore a different dress, this one pale yellow with white lace at the collar. Her face was flushed and her eyes, green like her riding habit, were fixed on Cato with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude? Curiosity? Fear? "Come forward," the governor said. His voice was measured, controlled, revealing nothing. Cato stepped into the room. The soldiers remained by the door. He could feel their presence behind him, protective rather than threatening, but present nonetheless. "Do you know who I am?" the governor asked. "Yes, sir," Cato replied. "You are Governor Scott. And do you understand the gravity of what happened this morning?" Cato hesitated. This felt like a trap, but he couldn't see the mechanism. "I pulled your daughter from the water, sir. She was drowning." "You saved her life," the governor said, his tone still neutral. "You, a former slave, risked your own safety to save the daughter of a Republican governor, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Do you understand what that means? Politically?" The room seemed to shift. Cato's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his face still. "I didn't think about politics, sir. I just thought about a girl who was drowning." "Papa," Catherine began, but the governor raised one hand, silencing her. "There are men in this city," the governor continued, "who would say you acted above your station. There are others who would say you should be celebrated as a hero. The truth is more complicated than either view. We're in the middle of Reconstruction. Everything is a symbol. Everything has political meaning. Your act of courage this morning has become, whether you intended it or not, a statement about the capacity of the formerly enslaved for citizenship, for heroism, for equality." He stood, walking around the desk to stand directly in front of Cato. They were nearly the same height, eye to eye. One man who held federal authority, one man who held nothing, not even the guarantee of safety. "What is your name?" the governor asked. "Cato, sir." "Just Cato? No surname?" "I took the name Freeman after the war, sir, when I realized I could choose my own name, Cato Freeman." The governor nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something he already knew. "Who is your employer?" "Mr. Thomas Gadsden, sir. I work the docks under contract to him." "Gadsden." The governor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. A former Confederate colonel, a difficult man, one of those who signed the Black Codes, who fought every Reconstruction measure, a man who believes the war never truly ended. He returned to his desk and sat, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Here is my dilemma, Cato Freeman. I owe you a debt, one that I cannot easily repay. You saved my daughter's life, and for that I am more grateful than words can express. But I also serve a political purpose. I represent federal authority in a state that despises that authority. Everything I do is scrutinized, criticized, used against me by those who want Reconstruction to fail." Catherine stepped forward. "Papa, please, he saved my life. Doesn't that transcend politics?" "Nothing transcends politics, child. Not here, not now." He looked at Cato again. "What would you want if you could have anything? If I had the power to grant you what you deserve?" The question caught Cato off guard. Even after emancipation, even with the promise of citizenship, no white person of authority had ever asked him what he wanted. His wants were still treated as irrelevant, his desires secondary to the needs of white society. "True freedom," Cato said quietly. "Not just legal freedom, but real freedom. The freedom to work where I choose, for wages I negotiate. The freedom to own land, to vote without intimidation, to live without fear of night riders and lynch mobs. That's what I would want." "Of course you would." The governor's smile was sad. "And you deserve it. Every formerly enslaved person deserves it. But deserving and receiving are two different things in South Carolina, 1869. He stood again, pacing now, his hands clasped behind his back. "However, I can offer you something. I will purchase your contract from Gadsden at triple the standard rate if necessary. You will be released from any debt or obligation to him. You will be, in the fullest legal sense, a free man with a federal guarantee of that freedom." Hope flared in Cato's chest, so sudden and fierce it was almost painful. Release from Gadsden's contract meant real autonomy, actual choice about where to work and how to live. "Thank you, sir," Cato said, his voice thick with emotion he struggled to contain. "Thank you." But the governor wasn't finished. He stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "However, there is a complication. If I free only you, if I reward only your courage, I make a statement that might be misinterpreted. Some will say I'm showing favoritism to a single Negro while ignoring the plight of thousands. Others will say I'm acknowledging individual merit while denying systemic injustice. Do you understand the political tightrope I'm walking?" Cato did understand. He understood perfectly. Reconstruction was failing because every act of justice was treated as a political statement. Every gesture toward equality was met with violent resistance. The governor couldn't simply reward courage without considering how that reward would be weaponized by his enemies. "I understand, sir," Cato said carefully. "I thought you might." The governor stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "So I must make a broader gesture. Something that satisfies justice and serves a political purpose. I have decided to release not just you, but 50 families from their contracts to Gadsden. 50 families, Cato Freeman. 237 souls in total, by my clerk's calculation." The room seemed to tilt. Cato felt Marcus's words from that morning echo in his mind. If we all just refused, all of us, at the same time. This wasn't refusal. This was something else entirely. This was transformation sanctioned by federal authority. "Why?" Cato managed to ask. "Because my daughter's life is worth that much to me. Because the people of Charleston need to see that Reconstruction means something. That federal authority can protect and liberate, not just occupy and punish. And because," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "because I am tired of watching this state resist every attempt at justice. I cannot force equality, but perhaps I can demonstrate its possibility." Catherine was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. She looked at Cato with an expression of overwhelming gratitude mixed with something else. Perhaps guilt, or the beginning of understanding about the world she lived in and the privileges she enjoyed. "There will be conditions," the governor continued. "The freed families must leave Charleston within 60 days. The political situation here is too volatile. I can protect you with federal authority, but I cannot protect you from every angry mob or Ku Klux Klan raid. I will provide transportation to Philadelphia or Washington, where freed communities have established themselves with some success. You will be given papers declaring your status and federal protection, but you must go." "We'll go," Cato said immediately. "We'll go anywhere, just—" His voice cracked. "Just tell me this is real. Tell me you won't be overruled." The governor walked to his desk and picked up a document already prepared, bearing federal seals and signatures. "I give you my word as a Union officer and as the military governor of South Carolina. By this time next week, you and 49 other families will be free of all contracts, debts, and obligations. Your names will be recorded in the Federal Registry. Your status will be legally unassailable." He handed the document to Cato. The paper felt impossibly light in his hands, yet it contained the weight of 237 futures, 237 lives transformed by one moment of impossible courage. "I have one request," Cato said, his eyes still fixed on the document, afraid that if he looked away it might disappear. "Name it. When I die, whenever that may be, I want something carved on my grave. I want it to say, 'I did not save a life. I gave others the right to live.'" The governor smiled, a real smile this time, touched with genuine respect. "That can be arranged, Cato Freeman. That can most certainly be arranged." News traveled through Charleston's freed community the way lightning travels through storm clouds, sudden, electric, impossible to contain. By the time Cato returned to the quarters that evening, everyone already knew. 50 families, federal protection, Philadelphia or Washington. The words repeated like a prayer, a miracle too vast to fully comprehend. The quarters were located 3 miles outside the city proper, a collection of rough wooden buildings that housed Gadsden's contract laborers. The structures had been slave quarters before the war, and little had changed except the name. Thin walls that leaked in the rain, dirt floors that turned to mud with every storm, roofs that barely held back the Carolina sun. But tonight, despite the poverty of their surroundings, the quarters burned with something that hadn't existed there in years: genuine hope. Cato found Marcus waiting outside his cabin, along with a crowd of at least 30 people. Old women who had survived both slavery and war. Young mothers holding children born into technical freedom but actual poverty. Men with backs like Cato's, mapped with scars from a system that hadn't ended so much as evolved. They stood in silence, watching him approach, their faces reflecting the flickering light of the torches they carried. "Is it true?" an old man named Samuel asked. His voice was rough from years of fieldwork, but it carried clearly in the still evening air. "Did the governor really say he's freeing 50 families with federal protection?" Cato held up the document, still clutched in his hand. "It's true. 50 families. We leave for Philadelphia in 60 days. With papers, protection, and federal guarantees." The crowd erupted. Women screamed with joy. Men embraced each other, tears streaming down faces that had forgotten how to show vulnerability. Children who didn't fully understand what was happening laughed and danced, caught up in the infectious energy of their parents' liberation. Marcus grabbed Cato's shoulders, shaking him. 50 families! Cato, do you understand what you've done? Do you understand? "I pulled a girl from the water," Cato said quietly. "That's all I did." "No," Samuel said, stepping forward. His eyes were bright with tears. "You gave us our lives back. You gave us futures. You gave our children," his voice broke, "you gave our children a chance to grow up truly free, not just free on paper, but free in reality." Cato looked around at the faces surrounding him, people he had lived beside for years, people who had become his family in the absence of blood relations. He thought of all the ways slavery had separated people, severed connections, turned human beings into isolated units of labor. And even after emancipation, the system had continued. New forms of bondage through debt and contracts and intimidation. Now, somehow, impossibly, 50 of these families would escape it all. "How will they choose?" a young woman named Ruth asked. She held an infant against her chest, her hand protective on the baby's head. 50 families out of how many? Over 200 families work under contract to Gadsden, Marcus said. How do we decide who gets federal protection and who stays vulnerable to the Klan and the Night Riders? The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible. In saving 50 families, Cato had inadvertently created a new form of suffering, the knowledge that protection existed, that escape was possible, but that it would be granted to some and not others. The governor left that to me, Cato said. He said I could choose. The crowd grew quiet. 50 families, 237 people. How did one man make such a choice? How did he decide who deserved protection most? The old who had suffered longest, the young who had their whole lives ahead, the families with children, those most vulnerable to Klan violence. I can't do this alone, Cato said. I won't do this alone. We'll form a council. 10 people who represent different parts of our community. We'll decide together. That's wise, Samuel agreed, but it won't make it easier. Choosing 50 families means leaving 150 without federal protection. I know. Cato's voice was heavy, but maybe, he paused, an idea forming. Maybe this is just the beginning. Maybe if we succeed in Philadelphia, if we build good lives there with federal support, we can find ways to bring others north. Maybe this isn't an ending. Maybe it's a door opening. It was a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. The crowd began to disperse, people returning to their cabins to tell family members, to begin imagining what real freedom might look like. Marcus stayed behind, sitting beside Cato on the cabin steps. You know Gadsden won't take this well, Marcus said. 50 families represents a fortune in labor contracts. The governor might be paying him compensation, but Gadsden built his post-war wealth on our backs. This will hurt him economically and politically. Good, Cato said simply. I mean it, Cato. He's a dangerous man when he's angry. He has connections to the Klan, and you've made yourself visible. You've made yourself a symbol. That's not safe, even with federal protection. Cato knew Marcus was right. Thomas Gadsden was one of Charleston's wealthiest former Confederates, a man who sat on the Democratic Party committee and dined with other unreconstructed rebels. He owned 3 plantations, worked by contract laborers, a fleet of ships, and controlled over 400 people through debt and legal manipulation. To him, this act of liberation wasn't justice. It was theft, sanctioned by a hated, occupying government. I'll be careful, Cato promised, but I'm not going to hide either. We have 60 days to prepare, 60 days to choose the families, gather supplies, plan our journey. I'm not wasting a single hour living in fear of men who already lost their war. Marcus smiled. You dove into the harbor without thinking. I guess I shouldn't expect you to start being cautious now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of celebration that still echoed through the quarters. Somewhere, someone was singing, an old spiritual that had been sung in fields and on ships, a song about crossing rivers and reaching promised lands. Tonight, for the first time since the war ended, those words felt like prophecy rather than distant hope. I want you on the council, Cato said. You're young, but you think clearly. We'll need that. Of course, Marcus replied. Who else are you considering? Samuel, definitely. Ruth, she knows every family with young children. Old Mary, who worked in the Gadsden house before the war and understands how the master thinks. Jacob, who learned to read and write from the Freedmen's Bureau teachers. We'll need him to keep records. Cato counted on his fingers. That's 5. We need 5 more who represent different parts of our community. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, building a council that would be as representative and fair as possible. It was after midnight when Marcus finally stood to leave. Cato, he said, pausing at the door, thank you for all of us. After Marcus left, Cato sat alone in the darkness of his cabin. The reality of what had happened was finally beginning to settle over him. This morning, He had been a contract laborer, technically free, but practically bound. Tonight, he was about to lead 237 people to actual freedom, protected by federal authority. He thought about his parents, both long dead, worked to death before emancipation could reach them. He thought about the countless people who had suffered and died in bondage, who had tasted freedom for only a moment before being crushed by the South's violent resistance to change. He thought about the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders, to make this freedom mean something, to honor those who hadn't survived by building lives worth living. The document from the governor lay on the rough wooden table. In the moonlight filtering through the cabin's one small window, Cato could just make out the federal seal, the carefully inscribed words, 50 families, 237 souls. He had saved one girl from drowning, and in doing so, he had somehow pulled 237 people toward genuine liberation. The next morning, Cato woke before dawn, as he always did, but this morning was different. He dressed not as a contract laborer preparing for another day of exploited work, but as a free man preparing for the most important work of his life. The council met in the old tobacco barn, a structure too dilapidated for storing valuable crops but perfect for gathering without attracting attention. Cato had chosen his 9 co-council members carefully: Samuel, Ruth, Old Mary, Jacob, Marcus, and 4 others who brought different perspectives and experiences to the task ahead. They sat in a circle on the dirt floor, a single lantern burning in their center. Each person carried a slate or a piece of paper, tools of literacy that the Freedmen's Bureau had made available, symbols of a new era where knowledge was no longer forbidden. "We have 60 days, Cato began, to choose 50 families and prepare them for the journey north. That means we need to work quickly but carefully. Every decision we make will change someone's life forever." "And we should start with the most vulnerable," Ruth suggested. "Families with many children, the elderly, those who've been targeted by night riders." "But those same families might struggle most with the journey," Old Mary interrupted gently. "The trip to Philadelphia is long and still dangerous. Confederate sympathizers control much of the route. We need to choose people who can survive it." "Are we playing God now?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Deciding who's strong enough to deserve protection?" The question silenced the group. This was the terrible mathematics of liberation. Calculating human worth, measuring suffering against survival, choosing who would receive federal protection and who would remain vulnerable. "We're not playing God," Cato said finally. "We're doing the best we can with an impossible situation. We balance needs against practicalities. We choose families that represent the full range of our community. And we make sure that everyone who stays behind knows that we will work to bring them north eventually." "How?" Jacob asked. He was one of the first to learn reading and writing from the bureau teachers, and he now taught others in secret evening classes. "How do we bring others north when we'll be starting over ourselves? We'll have no money, no connections, We'll have each other," Marcus interrupted. "And we'll have something more valuable than money. We'll have federal protection. We'll have the right to work for ourselves, to keep what we earn, to vote, to build communities without fear of the Klan. In Philadelphia, there are already thriving freed communities, churches, schools, mutual aid societies. We won't be alone." "Marcus is right," Cato agreed. "But we need to be strategic. We should prioritize families with skills that will help us all survive. Carpenters, blacksmiths, midwives, teachers. People who can contribute to building a new community that can eventually help others escape." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, methodically going through every family under contract to Gadsden. Each name sparked a story, a memory, a calculation of worth and need. It was exhausting work, emotionally devastating but necessary. By evening they had a preliminary list. 50 families representing a cross-section of ages, skills and needs, young and old. Skilled and unskilled, those who had been enslaved for decades and those born during the war. It wasn't perfect. No list could be perfect, but it was fair. They had done the best they could with an impossible task. "We'll post this list tomorrow morning," Cato said. "We'll give people 3 days to appeal if they think we've made a mistake. The council will hear every appeal fairly." "And then?" Ruth asked. "And then we prepare. We gather supplies. We arrange transportation with the federal authorities. We learn everything we can about Philadelphia and what awaits us there." Cato looked around at the faces in the lamplight. "We have 60 days to transform from contract laborers into truly free citizens. That's not much time to claim what should have been ours all along." Samuel nodded slowly. "It's going to be hard, even in Philadelphia, even with federal protection. The North has its own prejudices, its own ways of keeping us in our place." "I know," Cato said, "but it's still better than here. At least there we'll have a fighting chance. Here we're just waiting for the federal troops to leave so the old order can reassert itself completely." The meeting adjourned as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As the council members dispersed, heading back to their cabins, Cato remained in the barn, looking at the list they had created. 50 families, 237 names, each one representing a life that would be protected, a future that would be possible. He thought about Catherine Scott, the girl whose life he had saved. She had no idea what her drowning would set in motion. She had no idea that her brief moment of peril would become the catalyst for so much change. And Cato himself, who was he becoming? He had spent 32 years being invisible, silent, careful. Even after emancipation, he had remained cautious, navigating a world where legal freedom meant little without economic power or political protection. Now, suddenly, he was a leader, a decision-maker, a symbol of something larger than himself. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Outside, the evening songbirds had begun their chorus. The air smelled of honeysuckle and approaching rain. 60 days until departure. 60 days to prepare for a journey into genuine freedom. Cato folded the list carefully and tucked it into his shirt, close to his heart. Then he walked out of the barn and into the gathering darkness, ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks into their 60 days, Thomas Gadsden arrived at the quarters. He came at midday, when most of the contract laborers were scattered across the docks and fields, when the quarters themselves were nearly empty, except for the very old, the very young, and the sick. He came in a black carriage pulled by matched grey horses, accompanied by 2 former Confederate soldiers who now served as overseers and a man whose expensive suit marked him as a lawyer. Cato was repairing the roof of old Mary's cabin when he saw the carriage approaching. His hands stilled on the hammer, his body tensing with an instinct cultivated over decades. When former Confederate officers arrived unexpectedly, violence usually followed. Word spread quickly through the quarters. Within minutes, everyone who could walk had gathered in the central yard. Mothers held children close. Old men stood with arms crossed, faces carefully neutral. The 50 families who had been chosen for federal protection clustered together, their recent joy now shadowed with anxiety. Gadsden stepped down from the carriage. He was a tall man, thin in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that calculated value the way other men calculated distance or time. He wore a coat of burgundy wool despite the heat, and across his chest hung a watch chain that had probably been hidden during the war, but was now displayed proudly, a symbol of the old order reasserting itself. Everything about him spoke of a man who refused to accept that his world had changed. "Where is he?" Gadsden demanded, his voice carrying across the yard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Where is the man called Cato Freeman?" Cato climbed down from the roof, setting his hammer aside. He walked forward slowly, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. Every freed person in the quarters understood the delicate choreography of this moment, the balance between showing the respect that avoided violence and maintaining the dignity that freedom demanded. "I'm Cato Freeman, sir," he said, deliberately using his chosen surname. Gadsden studied him with eyes that were both intelligent and utterly without empathy. "You're the one who saved the governor's daughter?" "Yes, sir." "And now, because of your heroism," the word dripped with sarcasm, "that carpetbagger Scott has decided to steal 50 of my families. Do you understand what that means?" "It means they'll be free, sir. Truly free." "Free?" Gadsden's laugh was harsh. "They were already free. Emancipation freed them. I employ them legally through voluntary contracts. The governor is interfering with legitimate business arrangements, violating my rights as a property owner and businessman." "The contracts were signed under duress," Cato said carefully. "When people are starving and their only choice is to sign or watch their children die, that's not voluntary." Gadsden stepped closer, and Cato could smell tobacco and expensive brandy on his breath. "You've learned to speak well, boy. Someone's been teaching you northern ideas. Maybe those Freedmen's Bureau agitators. Maybe one of those carpetbagger missionaries who think they can remake the South in their image. I learned to think for myself, sir. That's what freedom means." "Freedom," Gadsden repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Let me tell you what freedom means, Cato Freeman. It means chaos. It means the natural order destroyed. It means former slaves thinking they're equal to their betters, demanding rights they're not equipped to handle, destroying an economy that functioned perfectly well before Yankees decided to interfere." The lawyer stepped forward, holding a thick sheaf of papers. "My client wishes to challenge Governor Scott's authority to void existing labor contracts. We have filed a petition with both the state court and the federal circuit court, arguing that the forced termination of legal contracts, even with compensation, constitutes an overreach of Reconstruction authority." Cato felt his stomach drop. "But the governor has federal backing that's increasingly tenuous," the lawyer said smoothly. "President Grant's administration is losing enthusiasm for Reconstruction. Northern voters are tired of Southern problems. The Democratic Party is resurgent. Courts are beginning to recognize that military governors have overstepped their constitutional authority. Our petition will be heard, and we believe we will prevail." "How long?" Marcus asked, stepping forward to stand beside Cato. "The courts will review our petition within 30 days, the lawyer replied. "Possibly sooner. The judge hearing the case is a South Carolinian, a man who understands traditional Southern values. 30 days, half of their preparation time, consumed by legal proceedings. And if the court ruled against the governor, if they decided that Gadsden's contract rights superseded Reconstruction authority, you can't do this," Cato said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "These people have been promised federal protection. You can't take that away." "I can do whatever the law allows," Gadsden said coldly. "And the law, ultimately, serves those who understand civilization, men like me. Not former slaves who think a single act of courage entitles them to destroy the social order." Old Mary stepped forward, her arthritic hands clasped before her. She had worked in the Gadsden household since she was a child, had raised Thomas Gadsden himself after his mother died. "Master Thomas," she said softly, using the old title out of habit. "You've known all of us for years, some of us since we were children. Doesn't that count for something? Doesn't our service—" "You were slaves," Gadsden interrupted, not even looking at her. "Your service was compelled, not given. And now that you're technically free, you owe me no less for the contracts you signed. A contract is sacred. It's what separates civilization from barbarism." The cruelty of it took Cato's breath away. Not because it was unusual. This attitude had defined the South before, during, and after the war. But because it was so casual, so complete. To Gadsden, emancipation had changed nothing fundamental. They were still property in all the ways that mattered, still subject to white authority, still obligated to serve. "Why are you doing this?" Cato asked. "The governor is compensating you generously. You'll make more money than you would have from the contracts." For the first time, something like emotion crossed Gadsden's face, a tightening around the eyes, a hardness in the jaw. "Because if I allow this, if I let 50 families walk away because some Republican governor feels sentimental, then every Negro in Charleston will start believing they truly deserve freedom. They'll start thinking they have rights beyond what we choose to grant them. They'll start imagining they're equal." He said the last word like an obscenity. "And that, Cato Freeman, is a contagion I cannot allow to spread. So I will fight this in court. I will use every legal tool at my disposal. I have connections to judges who understand what's at stake. And when I win, because I will win, these 50 families will remain exactly where they are, bound by contracts they cannot escape." Gadsden turned back to his carriage, then paused. "Oh, and Cato, the governor's protection only extends so far. Federal troops won't always be here. Reconstruction will end eventually, probably sooner than you think, and when it does, men like me will remember who caused us trouble. The Klan has a long memory." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Then Gadsden climbed into his carriage and departed, leaving the freed community standing in stunned, horrified silence. That evening, Cato called an emergency council meeting. They gathered in the tobacco barn again, but the atmosphere was completely different from their first meeting. Then they had been full of hope and federal backing. Now they were drowning in uncertainty. "We need to go to the governor," Ruth said immediately. "Tell him what Gadsden is doing. He can't let the courts overturn his authority." "The governor doesn't control the courts," Jacob replied. "Reconstruction authority is complicated. If Gadsden can prove that contract rights are being violated, if he can find a sympathetic judge—" "Then what?" Marcus demanded. "We just accept it. We let Gadsden win." "We don't have a choice," Samuel said heavily. "We never had a choice. Even with emancipation, even with Reconstruction, our freedom is still at the mercy of people like Gadsden and judges who miss the old order." "No." Cato's voice cut through the despair. "We do have a choice. We can wait for the court to decide our fate, or we can take our fate into our own hands." The council members looked at him confused. Then understanding began to dawn on their faces, followed quickly by fear. "You're talking about running," Old Mary said quietly. "You're talking about becoming fugitives, again, just like before the war. I'm talking about refusing to let our freedom depend on white judges arguing about whether Reconstruction has gone too far." Cato leaned forward, his voice intense. "We have 30 days before the court rules. That's time. We can use it." "Use it how?" Ruth asked. "We're 3 miles from Charleston, surrounded by former Confederate veterans and Klan sympathizers. Philadelphia is 800 miles north through territories where Reconstruction barely exists. How do we move 237 people that distance without being caught?" "We don't move all at once," Cato said. "We move in small groups, families of 4 or 5. We use what's left of the Underground Railroad and the network of Freedmen's Bureau stations." The Underground Railroad had evolved after the war. It was no longer just about escaping slavery, but about escaping the South entirely, helping freed people reach northern states where federal protection was more reliable, where the Klan's reach was limited, where building a new life was actually possible. "We don't even know how to contact them anymore," Jacob said. "The railroad operates differently now, and it's still secret because helping people escape labor contracts can get you killed." "We start by finding one person," Cato replied. "One contact at the Freedmen's Bureau, one sympathetic station master. Then we follow the chain north." "And if we're caught?" Samuel's voice was grim. "Breaking contracts makes us criminals. They'll use convict leasing. We'll end up right back in slavery under a different name." Some of us will die. Some of us will die anyway, Cato said. That's what this system is, a slow death dressed up as freedom. At least if we run, we die fighting for something real. At least we choose. The council fell silent, each person wrestling with the impossible decision. Stay and wait for the court, or run and risk everything, legal process or direct action. Hope or defiance. I'm going, Marcus said suddenly. Whether the rest of you come or not, I'm going. I've spent 25 years in bondage and 4 years in fake freedom. I won't spend another day that way if I have a choice. I'm going too, Ruth said, holding her infant closer. My daughter will not grow up watching her mother bow to former slaveholders. She will know real freedom, even if I die getting her there. One by one, the council members spoke, each voice adding weight to the decision, each commitment making the impossible seem slightly less so. We'll need to be smart, Cato said. We'll need to plan carefully. We send the first group within the week, our fastest travelers, people who can scout the route and establish contacts with bureau agents. The rest follow in waves, spread across the next 3 weeks. What about those who aren't chosen? Old Mary asked. The families who aren't part of the 50? This was the question that haunted Cato. In running, they would be abandoning over 150 families. People who had celebrated with them, who had hoped alongside them. People who would be left behind to face Gadsden's wrath and the clan's violence when the escape was discovered. We tell them the truth, Cato said. We give them the choice. Anyone who wants to run, we help. Anyone who wants to stay and fight through the courts, we respect. But we don't force anyone. This has to be their decision. The meeting lasted until well after midnight. They planned routes that would take them through areas with federal troop presence or Freedmen's Bureau stations. They identified families most suited for early departure. They discussed supplies and strategies and what to do if they were caught. They were no longer a council choosing who would receive federal protection. They were revolutionaries planning an escape that could change hundreds of lives or end them. As the council dispersed, Marcus pulled Cato aside. You know this is it, right? Once we start running, there's no going back. We become fugitives. The governor can't protect us anymore. We'll be proving Gadsden right about Reconstruction creating chaos. I know, Cato said. And you're still willing to do it? Cato thought about the moment he had dove into the harbor. He hadn't thought then either. He had simply acted, driven by something deeper than calculation. A fundamental belief that some things were worth any risk. I'm willing, he said. Marcus gripped his shoulder. Then let's finish what the war started. The first group left on a moonless night, exactly 1 week after Gadsden's threat. 10 people, 2 families, plus 2 young men who volunteered to serve as scouts. They carried almost nothing, a few changes of clothes, dried food, the federal protection papers the governor had already issued. Everything else would be acquired along the way or done without. In fleeing, they had learned the first lesson of genuine freedom. You cannot carry your chains with you, even the legal ones. Cato watched them disappear into the darkness beyond the quarters, heading northeast toward the Santee River. Marcus was among them, along with Ruth and her infant daughter. They would follow the river north, staying off main roads, moving only at night, seeking out Freedmen's Bureau stations where sympathetic agents might provide shelter and guidance. With luck, they would reach the first safe station within 3 days. With luck. The next morning, Cato woke before dawn and went to work at the docks as usual. It was essential to maintain appearances, to give no indication that anything had changed. The overseers must not suspect. Gadsden must not know. The entire plan depended on secrecy and timing. But as he loaded barrels onto ships that morning, his mind was 800 miles north, following 10 fugitives through swamps and forests, praying they would survive. 2 days later, the second group departed. 12 people this time, including old Mary, despite her arthritis and protests from others that she was too frail for such a journey. I've been enslaved for 63 years and technically free for 4, she told Cato before leaving. If I die truly free tomorrow, that's 1 day more than I expected. Don't you dare tell me I'm too old for this. The groups continued leaving every 3 to 4 days, small enough to move quickly, spread out enough to avoid drawing attention if one group was caught or encountered Confederate veterans looking for trouble. Cato coordinated everything, maintaining lists of who had left and who remained, tracking which routes were safe and which had been compromised by hostile forces. He sent messengers ahead to each group when possible, carrying information about freedmen's bureau stations and sympathetic conductors. The network was revealing itself slowly, cautiously. Not everyone they encountered could be trusted. Some bureau agents were northern opportunists who cared nothing for freed people, and some supposed allies were actually Confederate sympathizers gathering intelligence. But enough people proved willing to help that the chain remained intact. 3 weeks after the first departure, 43 families had fled. 192 people had escaped into the darkness, leaving behind only Cato and 7 other families who would form the final group. They waited, maintaining the fiction of normalcy, covering for the missing workers by redistributing tasks and telling overseers that people were sick or working different shifts or temporarily assigned elsewhere. The deception couldn't last forever, but it only needed to last a few more days. Then Gadsden's overseer, Samuel Pritchard, began asking questions. "Where's Marcus?" he demanded one morning, standing over Cato on the dock. "I haven't seen him in 2 weeks." "Sick," Cato replied, not looking up from the barrel he was loading. "Fever. He's in the quarters." "And Ruth? And old Mary? And Jacob?" Pritchard's voice was rising. "Half the workers are missing, Cato Freeman." "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't notice?" Cato set down the barrel and straightened slowly. There was no point lying anymore. The truth was about to break open, and he needed to be ready for it. "They're gone," Cato said simply. Pritchard's face went purple. "Gone? Gone where?" "North, to real freedom. Away from men like Gadsden who think emancipation was just a temporary inconvenience." For a moment the overseer seemed unable to speak. Then he grabbed Cato by the shirt, pulling him close. "You helped them run. You organized this. You're going to hang, boy. You're going to—" The sound of hoofbeats interrupted him. They both turned to see a rider approaching, a young man in Union cavalry uniform, his horse bearing the insignia of the federal garrison. "Message for Cato Freeman," the rider called out, "from Governor Scott." Pritchard released Cato, stepping back with obvious reluctance. The rider dismounted and handed Cato a sealed letter. He broke the wax seal and read, "Cato, the court has ruled in our favor. Gadsden's petition is denied. Federal authority over labor contracts is upheld. All 50 families remain under federal protection. However, I have learned that many have already fled. This was unnecessary, but understandable given the threats. Gadsden has vowed to pursue fugitives and claims you organized an illegal escape. I can protect you legally, but not from extra-legal violence. Leave Charleston immediately. Papers are enclosed guaranteeing your safe passage." R.K. Scott. Cato read the message twice, hardly daring to believe it. They had won legally. The 43 families who had already fled were protected by federal authority. They were free citizens exercising their right to move, not fugitives breaking contracts. And the 7 families remaining with Cato were now legally free to leave openly, with federal papers and military protection. Pritchard snatched the letter from his hands, reading it with growing fury. "This changes nothing," he spat. "Mr. Gadsden has friends, the Klan has friends, federal protection won't last forever, Reconstruction will end, and when it does, we'll be 800 miles away," Cato said. "Building lives you can't touch, raising children who won't even remember slavery or fear of men like you." That evening, Cato gathered the remaining 7 families. They stood in the quarters, now mostly empty, echoing with absence, and discussed their final departure. "We can leave legally now," Cato explained. "We have papers, we have federal protection, we can take a train north, travel openly with military escort if needed." "And leave the others who walked?" asked a woman named Sarah. "While we ride comfortable." "They made it," Cato said, Most of them, anyway. He didn't mention the 2 people who had been caught near the Virginia border by Confederate veterans and beaten nearly to death, or the child who had died of fever in a Freedmen's Bureau station. Some truths were too heavy to share yet. "Then we walk too," Sarah said firmly. "We don't take the easy path while our people walk the hard one. We walk together." The others agreed. 7 families, 32 people in total, would make the final journey on foot, following the same route as those who had gone before. They would arrive in Philadelphia not as legal freedmen taking advantage of federal protection, but as people who had claimed their own liberation through courage and solidarity. They left at midnight on a Saturday, when security was laxest. Cato walked at the rear of the group, looking back one final time at the quarters that had been his prison before the war and his cage after it. Somewhere in the darkness behind them, Pritchard was surely organizing pursuit. Somewhere ahead, Gadsden was plotting revenge with his clan associates. But in this moment, walking north beneath a sky full of stars, Cato was free. They all were. The journey took 23 days. They traveled through South Carolina, into North Carolina, across Virginia, through Maryland. Federal troops controlled some areas, but large swathes of territory were still dominated by unreconstructed Confederates, who saw helping fugitives as a betrayal of Southern honor. They slept in Freedmen's Bureau stations when possible, in barns and caves when necessary. They ate what they could forage or what sympathetic agents provided. 3 times they heard riders in the distance, possibly Klan, possibly just former Confederate soldiers looking for any excuse to reassert dominance. Twice they saw night riders burning crosses on distant hills, warning signs that some territories were still Confederate in everything but name. But they kept moving, north, always north, toward the city where 43 families waited, where federal authority was more than paper promises, where building a new life was actually possible. On the 23rd day, they crested a hill and saw Philadelphia spread below them. The city was larger than Charleston, more crowded, more chaotic, but somewhere in those streets were people who looked like them, who had fought for freedom and won, who had built communities and churches and schools despite ongoing prejudice. Somewhere down there was Marcus, Ruth and her daughter, old Mary, Jacob, Samuel. All the families who had left before them, who had survived the journey and begun building new lives. Cato stood on that hill, with tears streaming down his face. Around him, the others were crying too, tears of exhaustion, relief, joy, grief for those left behind, hope for what came next. "We made it," Sarah whispered. "We actually made it." They descended into Philadelphia as the sun set, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets. They had no money, no homes, no certainty about what tomorrow would bring. But they had each other. They had their freedom, real freedom, protected by federal authority and defended by their own courage. And they had proven that even Reconstruction's failures couldn't stop determined people from seizing their own liberation. In a small house on the outskirts of the city, Marcus was waiting. When he saw Cato approaching, he ran out into the street, laughing and crying simultaneously. They embraced like brothers, 2 men who had walked through hell together and emerged on the other side. "You did it," Marcus said. "You saved us all." "We saved each other," Cato corrected. "That's how freedom works. We save each other." Philadelphia, May 1870, nearly a year after Cato dove into Charleston harbor. The house on Lombard Street was small but sturdy, its wooden frame recently painted, its windows fitted with real glass. It stood in the heart of what was becoming Philadelphia's thriving black neighborhood, a community of former slaves, freed people, and those who had never known bondage. The streets here hummed with life and possibility that felt impossible in the South. Inside, Cato sat at a table he had built himself, using skills he'd learned decades ago, but had never been able to apply for his own benefit until now. Around him sat the council, the same 9 people who had planned their escape, now planning their future. We've confirmed that 48 of the 50 families made it to Philadelphia, Jacob reported, reading from the careful records he maintained. 2 families are in Boston. We've had word that they're safe and working. And those who were caught? Ruth asked. Jacob's face grew somber. 2 adults were captured in Virginia by former Confederate soldiers. They were beaten severely and threatened with convict leasing, but federal troops intervened. They eventually made it here. 2 children died during the journey, one from fever, one from an accident crossing a river at night. The room fell silent. 2 children whose bid for freedom had cost them their lives. Their names were written in Jacob's book, but also in the hearts of everyone present, a reminder that their liberation had come with a cost. We'll honor them, Cato said firmly. When we build our church, their names will be carved in stone. They died free, and that matters. We're making real progress, Marcus said, steering the conversation toward more immediate concerns. I'm working at the shipyard now. Real wages, paid directly to me in cash I can save. Sarah has found work as a seamstress with her own shop. Several of our families have secured positions in households, but as paid employees with contracts, they negotiated themselves. The AME church has been a blessing, old Mary added. She looked healthier than she had in years, her face fuller, her movements less pained. Freedom, it seemed, had medicinal properties. Reverend Allen's people have provided food, clothing, connections to employers. Without their support, we'd still be struggling to find our feet. Richard Allen had founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816, creating the first independent black denomination in America. Now in his 70s, he still worked tirelessly to help formerly enslaved people build new lives in the North. We need to think long-term, Samuel said. We're surviving, but we need to thrive. We need property, businesses, education for our children. We need to build something permanent that can't be taken away when political winds shift. Agreed, Cato said. Which brings me to something I've been considering. He pulled out a sheet of paper covered with numbers and calculations. There are 16 men among our families with carpentry skills, 3 blacksmiths, 5 women who are expert seamstresses. If we pool our resources, we could start a cooperative, a business owned by all of us, that employs our people and generates income for the community. The idea was radical. Most freed people in Philadelphia worked for white employers, grateful for whatever wages they could earn. But Cato was proposing something different: economic independence, collective ownership, a model that could spread beyond their small community. It would require capital, Jacob noted. Tools, materials, workspace. We'd need to save for months, maybe years. Then we save, Cato said simply. We came 800 miles on foot, with federal troops pursuing us and Confederate sympathizers trying to stop us. We can do this too. The council discussed the proposal for hours, refining the details, identifying challenges, assigning responsibilities. By the time they adjourned, they had the framework for something unprecedented, a worker-owned business that would provide not just employment, but dignity, not just survival, but prosperity. As the others filed out, Marcus lingered behind with Cato. "There's something you should know," Marcus said quietly. "I received a letter today, from Charleston." Cato felt his stomach tighten. "From who?" "Catherine Scott, the governor's daughter." Marcus handed over a folded piece of paper sealed with wax. "It arrived at the church, addressed to you." Cato broke the seal and read, "Dear Cato Freeman, I hope this letter finds you well and safe in Philadelphia. I have heard, through my father's sources, of your successful journey north with nearly all of the freed families. I wanted you to know that your courage continues to inspire me. My father's position as governor has become increasingly difficult. The Democrats have won control of the state legislature, and Reconstruction is being systematically dismantled. Federal troops are being withdrawn. The Klan operates almost openly now. My father fears that everything he worked for, everything you fought for, will be undone within a few years. I write also to tell you that Mr. Gadsden has abandoned his pursuit. The cost of tracking people across state lines proved too expensive, and the political situation shifted when you won the court case. However, he has successfully lobbied for stricter enforcement of labor contracts and convict leasing laws. Many freed people who remained in Charleston are now effectively re-enslaved under different names. You said that night in our parlor that you wanted words carved on your grave. I did not save a life. I gave others the right to live. I think about that often. I think about how you gave me my life back, but also how your actions gave so many others theirs. I am 18 now and recently married to a young man from Boston, a Republican lawyer who shares my father's views on Reconstruction. He's working with the NAACP precursor organizations, trying to preserve some of what was gained. It is hard work and often feels futile, but he persists. I wonder sometimes what the South will become when Reconstruction ends completely. Will it return to something close to slavery? Will the promises made to 4 million freed people simply vanish? The thought keeps me awake at night. Please know that you are remembered here, Cato Freeman. Not by everyone. Many still curse your name and blame you for encouraging resistance. But by those of us who believe that courage and justice matter more than tradition and order, you are a hero. I wish you every happiness in your new life. You earned it. With admiration and gratitude, Catherine Scott Cato folded the letter carefully, his eyes burning with unexpected tears. Catherine Scott, the girl whose drowning had set everything in motion, had grown into someone who understood the significance of what had happened and was troubled by what she saw coming. "Are you going to write back?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," Cato said honestly. "What would I say? That I'm grateful Reconstruction is failing, that I'm glad we escaped when we did. You could tell her the truth, that her life was just the beginning, that saving her let us save ourselves, and that even if Reconstruction fails completely, we've proven that freedom is possible when people are willing to fight for it." Cato nodded slowly. Perhaps he would write back, perhaps not. Either way, Catherine Scott would live her life fighting battles she might not win, trying to preserve gains that were already slipping away. And he would live his life here in Philadelphia, building something new from nothing, proving that genuine freedom was not a gift bestowed by governments, but a reality created by determined people. 3 months later, the cooperative opened, a workshop on Vine Street that employed 23 people and produced furniture, tools, and textiles. They called it Freeman's Workshop, and within a year it was profitable enough to allow them to purchase the building outright. 2 years later, they had saved enough to fund rescue operations. They brought 12 more families north from Charleston and other southern cities, using the network they had established and the resources they had accumulated. Each arrival was celebrated as proof that the work of liberation was ongoing. 5 years later, Cato married a woman named Elizabeth, a former slave from Virginia who had arrived in Philadelphia around the same time as his group. They had 3 children together, all born free, all educated in the school that the community had established with funds from Freeman's Workshop. 10 years later, Cato stood before a crowd of 200 people at the expansion of Mother Bethel AME Church. He had donated generously to the building fund, but his real contribution was his story, living proof that change was possible, that the impossible could be achieved through courage and community. 15 years later, in 1884, Reconstruction had officially ended. Federal troops withdrew from the South. The Democratic Party regained control. Jim Crow laws were being enacted across former Confederate states. The brief promise of equality was being systematically dismantled. But in Philadelphia, Cato Freeman watched his grandchildren play in streets where they would never be enslaved. He worked in a business he owned collectively with other freed people. He voted in elections where his ballot was actually counted. He lived in a community that was building schools, churches, and mutual aid societies that would last generations. The South might be returning to something close to slavery, but he and 237 others had escaped. They had built something real, and they were helping others escape whenever possible. 20 years later, in 1889, Cato Freeman was 62 years old and dying. The fever had come on suddenly, burning through him like a wildfire. The doctor, a black physician trained at Howard University, said there was nothing to be done. His family gathered around his bed, Elizabeth, his children, his grandchildren, and a house full of friends who had walked the long road from Charleston to freedom beside him. Marcus sat closest, holding Cato's hand. They were both old men now, their hair white, their bodies bearing the marks of hard labor and harder lives. But they had lived to see their children grow up free. They had built something that would outlast them. "Remember what you told me," Marcus said softly. "That day in the quarters, when we first learned about the 50 families. You said maybe this was just the beginning. Maybe we could bring others north eventually." Cato smiled weakly. "Did we?" "We brought hundreds," Marcus said. "Through the workshop, through the church, through the networks we maintained. We didn't save everyone, but we saved more than anyone thought possible. And we showed that it could be done." "Not enough," Cato whispered. "The South is returning to slavery under different names. Jim Crow, convict leasing, sharecropping. We escaped, but millions didn't." "But they know it's possible now," Marcus said. "Because of you, because of us. They know that resistance works, that courage matters, that freedom can be claimed, not just granted. That matters, Cato. That will always matter." As night fell, Cato's breathing became labored. His family sang softly, spirituals from their days in bondage, transformed now into songs of triumph rather than sorrow. Elizabeth held one hand, Marcus the other, and his children surrounded the bed with their children. Just before dawn, Cato opened his eyes one last time. He looked around at the faces of those he loved, at the life he had built, at the freedom that surrounded him like warm light. "I did not save a life," he whispered, repeating the words he had spoken to Governor Scott so many years ago. "I gave others the right to live." Then Cato Freeman closed his eyes and was gone. His funeral was attended by over 500 people, former slaves and freeborn citizens, black and white, Republicans who still believed in Reconstruction's promise, and abolitionists who had fought for decades. They came from Philadelphia and New York, from Boston and Washington. They came to honor a man who had proved that one moment of courage could change hundreds of lives. They buried him in Eden Cemetery, the first cemetery in the United States established specifically for African Americans. His headstone read exactly what he had requested: Cato Freeman, 1837-1889. "I did not save a life. I gave others the right to live." Years later, historians would debate the significance of Cato's story. Some would see it as a footnote to Reconstruction's failure, a brief moment of hope before Jim Crow crushed the dreams of equality. Others would see it as proof that even when governments fail, individuals can succeed in claiming freedom through courage and solidarity. But in Philadelphia's black community, there was no debate. Cato Freeman was remembered as a hero, a liberator, a man who dove into dangerous waters not just once but repeatedly throughout his life, always pulling others toward freedom. His descendants, and he had many, carried his name and his legacy forward. They became teachers, ministers, doctors, activists, politicians. They fought against Jim Crow. They marched for civil rights. They sat at lunch counters and rode buses and refused to accept that their humanity was negotiable. And whenever they felt afraid, whenever the struggle seemed too hard, they remembered the story of their ancestor who stood on a Charleston dock in 1869 and made a choice that echoed through generations: to risk everything for the chance to be free. The sea that had nearly claimed Catherine Scott's life had, in a way, given birth to a movement. And at the center of that movement was a man named Cato, who understood something fundamental about freedom. It is never simply given, it is claimed. It is defended, it is lived, one courageous moment at a time. In Charleston, Catherine Scott lived to be an old woman. She married her Republican lawyer and spent decades working for civil rights organizations, though the cause seemed increasingly futile as Jim Crow laws spread across the South. She never spoke publicly about the slave who saved her life. By the 1890s, such stories were seen as embarrassing reminders of Reconstruction's excesses. But she donated generously to black educational institutions, and in her will she left a substantial sum to the AME Church in Philadelphia to be used for schools serving freed people's descendants. The donation arrived with a note, unsigned but written in handwriting, that church officials recognized as hers, for Cato Freeman, who gave me my life so that others might live theirs. May this be repayment, however inadequate, for a debt that can never truly be settled. The money funded a school that operated for 60 years, educating thousands of black children who might otherwise have remained illiterate. The school was named Freeman Academy, and above its entrance hung a plaque with those words Cato had requested for his grave. History is made of such connections, of lives saved and debts honored, of courage inspiring more courage, of one moment in Charleston Harbor rippling outward until it touched the lives of thousands. Cato Freeman dove into the water to save one girl. In doing so, he pulled an entire community toward freedom. And the water, which had witnessed so much suffering aboard slave ships and along auction block harbors, had finally witnessed something else: redemption, courage, and the proof that even when governments fail, determined people can still claim their own liberation. The story of Cato Freeman, the slave who became a hero, the property who became a person, the man who refused to let fear define his choices, lived on in songs and sermons, in family stories passed down through generations, in the very streets of Philadelphia where his descendants still walked free. And somewhere, in the archives of Charleston, his name endured, written in faded ink and salt, just as the legend promised. Cato Freeman, the man the sea would not drown because it knew he had to show the world what freedom looked like when people had the courage to claim it.